All across the United States, thousands upon thousands of people who lived and died in state hospitals lie buried in asylum cemeteries, their remains unclaimed and often names unknown, likely due to mental health stigma and to ableism. Kinsong, Ode to Disability Ancestors, is a devised digital performance ritual. Sometimes we say cybernetic seance, crafted in response to this injustice. Together, our team of disabled and non-disabled artists have come together to join creative forces using image and text and movement and puppetry to call upon the spirits of these disability ancestors, to wake them from their unmarked graves and join us in an act of celebration and of mourning, all before finally laying them to rest. So I am a PhD candidate in performance as public practice at the UT Department of Theater and Dance, and this performance really originated from that PhD research. In some ways, it started in the UT Fine Arts Library. I have here a book. It's very big. It's a photo book by David Maisel, photographer, and the book is called Library of Dust. And I found this in the UT Stacks, and was just immediately drawn to it. I don't know if you can see. I'm holding a very large book. And it has a canister that's enlarged, and on it you can see these swirls of blue and green and white mineral deposits on its copper surface. Again, it's visually stunning. At the same time, you learn as you flip through the pages that these aren't just canisters; they're in fact urns. There's over 3,500 of them, and they hold the unclaimed cremated remains of people who lived and died at Oregon State Hospital between around 1883, and I believe the latest was 1974. I don't know how to explain the feeling that I had when I encountered this photo book. I think the best I've been able to do so far is to describe it as kinship, as familiar feeling, as affiliation, and a sense of being overcome with a need to embrace those who had departed. And so that became the subject of my dissertation research, thinking about how can performance better help us perceive and engage with the way that these histories of institutionalization continue to reach into our present. And so I hopped on a plane. I went to actually visit Oregon State Hospital, and a really, really moving memorial that had been constructed there to house these canisters, these cremated remains. I went there expecting to feel a particular way. I think I had some feelings that I wanted to resolve. And yet, when I sat on the bench and took in the memorial, my primary feeling was frustration. I didn't know what to do. I started glancing around, and I saw, someone had left some flowers. Oh no, I didn't bring flowers. I can't do the proper thing to remember. And then I look over here and I see a small stack of stones, and I'm wondering, is this a cairn? Did someone make this as an act of memorialization? Should I stack stones? And just sitting, running through things and going, I don't know what to do. And so rather than resolve the feeling, it was magnified. I think that's productive. in some ways, I think the memorial gave me something quite meaningful, um, a deeper awareness of what that want is, what that desire is. And so I don't want to dismiss it. I want to protect that feeling. And as someone who does not work in wood and stone and metal and other mediums, I think more common to architecture, but rather in bodies, in voices, in motion, as we do with performance. I felt such a need to make something, to do something, to gather members of our community, and find a way to use performance also as a memorial, of flesh and bone, of movement, of sound, to connect and to engage the past and its presence in our present. Kinsong addresses multiple themes, but I think there's two that I want to draw particular attention to. The first is this idea of grief. So there are two scholars working in what is called MAD studies who write about grief. And part of what they talk about is the cultural codes that we have, particularly in the US, around appropriate grief. We have different expectations for what grief should look like, how it should be enacted, when it should be enacted, for how long, and so on. Oftentimes pathologizing grief that is perceived to be too long, too excessive, too big, in the wrong time and place, and so on. But what these scholars suggest is an investment in what they call mad grief, in grief that does precisely all of those things that our cultural codes tell us not to. Grief that is enacted long after the fact, for too long. Grief that is intensely embodied, connecting us to the wisdom of our far-reaching emotional capacities. And so with this project in particular, we've been exploring some of those themes. What are the gifts of grief? And most importantly, what are the gifts of shared grief? How can we hold space for one another and create that kind of space for grief that is often considered inappropriate? At the same time, there's also an intense investment in celebration. Our communities have survived so much and developed beautiful, meaningful ways of being and creating together despite mental health stigma, despite ableism. And so by coming together and bringing some of those strategies into performance, we're hoping to not only carry those traditions forward, but also to recognize the brilliance in them. You know, the fact that these sites exist, that there is often no grave marker, can tell us a lot. The use of a headstone, for example, is that it marks the spot in anticipation of someone who might come after, someone who might want to remember. And so the absence of those markers, of those aids, can tell us that in some ways, perhaps these sites imagined a future in which no one would come to remember. No one would need the grave marker because no one would be interested. And so I think we have an opportunity with this performance to demonstrate that the futures that those sites imagined simply have not come to pass. That we, as a creative team of disabled and non-disabled artists, in conjunction with our audiences, are able to be together in digital space and to say, we remember. We have come in spite of the absence of markers. And we will use our bodies. We will use song, we will use movement, we will use puppetry, and those will become the markers. And we will carry those markers in us as an embodied memorial, as a way, I think, of correcting a cosmic injustice and ensuring that the beautiful traditions of resistance, of struggle, of shared support that disabled and mad communities have created over decades continues to blossom into a beautiful shared future. So in order to make this production, we went a little bit of a non-traditional route. Instead of having people assigned only to specific roles, we had a more team-based approach. So we had a core creative team, and then we had ensemble members, and also a design team. But there was a lot of dialogue within teams and then amongst teams in order to create the piece. Another component of this was it was mostly digital, meaning that we were rehearsing on Zoom and then doing some select filmings either individually or in person. And that ended up, while challenging, really opening up some new tools for us in ways that I think are interesting and might even open access to more artists and to more audience members. To produce the piece, we worked with two choreographers, so Molly Roy and Shannon Woods, and worked with the ensemble to create what we ended up calling morning scores. So these are gestural patterns that are derived from actors' individual, familial, or cultural grief practices, and then translated into physical gestures, almost turning the body itself into a kind of memorial. What we did once those scores were created was we took them on the move. So we started by Epoch Coffee House, where the Austin State Hospital Cemetery is located, and actually had the performers recreate those scores while they were moving around the perimeter of the cemetery. We then kept the parade going. We went past UT Intramural Fields, past the Triangle Shopping District, past the current Austin State Hospital, and into Central Park, essentially tracing with our bodies what was the initial footprint of Austin State Hospital. And in some ways, while the cemetery is displaced from the current hospital, that path that we trace with our bodies rejoins the two. Again, it's a kind of embodied memorial, embodied memory. And so while the project itself is not about Austin State Hospital, it's about these asylum cemeteries more broadly, thinking about those histories in our own local context proved to be quite important. A lot of that work was about thinking about ourselves in relation to the past, but we also wanted to spend some time on offering a vision of the future. Again, drawing on the wisdom of disability ancestors and thinking of ourselves either as disabled folks, as non-disabled allies. What resources would we want to generate for future people who might join this community? And so we use shadow puppetry to re-narrate the origin of disability, which is often, as UT professor Dr. Allison Kafer writes about, positioned as the sign of no future. A good future in our sci-fi media is often one in which disability and illness no longer exist. And while a desire to eliminate pain and increase comfort is certainly laudable, there's also profound wisdom and brilliance and meaning in physical and mental experiences that might be currently narrated as atypical. And so thinking about for our community, how do we want to welcome those who may be new to disability communities? What kind of futures do we want to see for ourselves? And how can we use storytelling and shadow puppetry specifically to bring that into being? So in some ways, this piece might visually and sonically feel a bit familiar to audiences, in the sense that I think it does more resemble an extended music video, perhaps, than a traditional theater performance. At the same time, it is a bit different in that we're intentionally calling it a performance ritual as opposed to a performance. So in the same way, I think that when engaging with perhaps maybe religious or spiritual performance, one wouldn't necessarily clap after. I think we're similarly asking for that kind of mode of engagement from audience members. It puts the audience in a bit of a different place. I don't want to say that the piece isn't for the audience. It certainly is. But it's also for the departed, for those disability ancestors who are no longer with us. And so in that sense, it has multiple modes of address and requires the audience to not only watch, but to, through their presence, come join us in the act that we're trying to bring into the world. The digital nature of the piece has also given us some really interesting new ways of working. So I think as a lot of people have experienced working entirely in digital space as people trained in live performance making poses several challenges. And we've actually found that they've prompted us to develop new ways of working together that might be more accessible. We're able to share space with those in our community who aren't able to be out and about yet, or maybe at all. People who maybe traditionally would be excluded from a rehearsal and production practice that's happening in a more conventional sense. It enabled us to be unwell together sometimes, to find ways when our bodies were maybe not cooperating, we're not at our most well, to still be artists together, to say in our headaches or our muscle aches, in our tired mental states, ways to be together and to still support one another through that, as opposed to just simply not being able to rehearse. Directors often get asked what you want the audience to take away from a performance. And in some sense, with this production in particular, I don't have a terribly strong opinion, in the sense that we all have such different relationship to the material. And so I want to make space and to honor those different relationships. And in that sense, I think, or I hope, I suppose, that audiences will take what they need from the piece, whatever that might be. I do have a small hope that perhaps those who identify as disabled, as a person living with a mental health concern or any related identities, might find a sense of acknowledgement, a sense of community, a sense of being held by the piece. And then I also hope that people who might not identify with those communities might, by the end of the piece, rethink that affiliation. Ask, even though I might not identify as disabled, how does ableism shape my life? How do ideas around what bodies and minds should be, how they should act in the world, impact me. And then I suppose one thing that I wonder if audiences might take is a sense of being haunted. I think in US culture that tends to have a very narrow implication. So to be haunted is somewhere between spooky and terrifying and not necessarily desirable. But I mean haunted in a really specific way. So there's a scholar named Avery Gordon who writes that to be haunted is to experience moments when what is seemingly over and done with suddenly emerges with particular force in our present, and we are suddenly able to perceive that which has been hidden, and the way that it impacts our current moment broadly and ourselves specifically. This can be frightening. It can be unsettling, to emotions that I think are worth experiencing. And what makes haunting unique for Gordon is this idea that haunting presents a something to be done. So it's not just that we understand ourselves in relation to a particular past, but that through that understanding, we also feel a sense that something must be done about this. And when we're dealing with these histories of institutionalization, with cemeteries in which people have been placed there to be forgotten, I can think of no more useful and productive feeling